reintroduce myself. My name is Deondre Smiles, PhD. I'm a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography up at the University of Victoria, up in beautiful BC, Canada. I am there by way of a bachelor's degree in geography from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, a master's degree in global Indigenous studies from the University of Minnesota, Duluth, and a PhD in geography from the Ohio State University, where I also did a year as a postdoc in the history department. So I live in Canada, but I've kind of moved around a bit. I'm originally from Minneapolis. My people our home base of our reservation is about 200 miles north of Minneapolis, up there in the beautiful lakes and sometimes very cold weather of northern Minnesota. But I moved around, and then I moved out to Ohio in 2016 to do the PhD, and then just moved up to Canada in September to start at my position at UVic. I'm actually speaking to you today from Columbus, Ohio, where my wife is still finishing up a degree at OSU. So I recognize that I'm speaking to you from occupied Miami and Shawnee lands. And I always usually start out my talk with a land acknowledgement, and we have a more robust one at UVic, but here I'm on different territories, and I want to recognize that. So when I started writing this talk, to talk about settler colonialism, to talk about Indigenous resistance and resilience can take a long, long time. And so the first draft of my talk was 4 hours. I'm kidding, of course, but it takes a long time. And a lot of times when we talk about this, we have to talk about it in more kind of broad scopes. And so I want to take you through kind of some basic threads of these topics that I do in my own work and things that I teach in the coursework that I teach and the research that I do at UVic and throughout my career. We will be together in this talk for at least 45-50 minutes. And then after that, I want to make sure that we have time to address any questions that you might have, or have a broader conversation about things that might come up for you in the talk. If that sounds good to you, that sounds good to me. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the term settler colonialism is probably a term that some of you have not heard before. And so whenever I start talking about anything related to settler colonialism, like any good educator, I want to start out by defining what exactly settler colonialism is. So the dry definition of settler colonialism, of course, is colonialism that is built upon settlement and enduring occupation of land by a colonizing power at the expense of Indigenous presence upon the land. Very dry, very sterile academic definition. So let me take a little bit to break this down. And so many times the form of colonialism that students grow up learning is a form of colonialism that has been called extractive colonialism, or quote, traditional colonialism. And that form of colonialism is built around the exploitation and extraction of resources out of a colony by a distant colonizing power. So one of the best examples that I can use is if we take a look at Africa and the history of infrastructural development in Africa. If you take a look at a map of Africa today, and you were to take a look at the roads and railroad lines and infrastructure, you'll notice that in countries that have a coast, the railroads and major roads oftentimes run from the interior to the coast. They don't really go deep into the interior themselves, but they're mainly between linking some cities in the interior to cities on the coastline, major ports and cities. And the reason for this was when European powers such as the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal colonized Africa, their idea at first was to get resources out of these colonies to help bolster their economies at home. And so they weren't as concerned about controlling space. If they were worried about controlling space, it was to ensure that they could exploit these resources safely. And the infrastructure that they built was made to bring goods to the coast when they would be loaded on ships and brought back to Europe. Of course, there were strands of what we would call settler colonialism in these places, but the prevailing scholarship around colonization really kind of set a difference between this form of colonization and then settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism Resources are important, of course, but really what is of vital importance is the land itself. So the late scholar Patrick Wolfe, who was an Australian scholar who helped pioneer, and I use that word obviously with some distaste, of course, pioneer the field of settler colonial studies, said really in settler colonialism, the colonizer comes to stay. They're not worried about shipping goods back to a mother country, but what they're more worried about is actually staying and putting down roots in the land that they colonized. And so Patrick Wolfe famously said, well, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. And what he meant by that is that while there is obviously a starting point for when colonization began in North America, for example, there isn't an end date in mind. The settler colony doesn't have a date where it says, well, we're going to pack up and we're going to go back to Europe. The idea, as I said, is they want to put down roots and they want to really build these structures infrastructurally, governmental-wise, culturally, that make sure that the colony exists into the present day. And so when we think about settler colonies nowadays, we oftentimes center on a series of countries that we call Anglo-settler colonies. And those countries include the United States, Canada, Australia, Aotearoa, or as you might better know it, New Zealand, South Africa, Israel. And these countries all have some common kind of heritage aspects to them. One of them is that they were former British colonies in some way, shape, or form. Israel was a British mandate, but there were aspects of colonization present in Israel as well. They also are countries that have been accepted to have been built upon the dispossession of the indigenous peoples of the land. So in the United States and Canada, we see, and as we'll talk about and kind of focus on in this talk, the dispossession of indigenous peoples from the land. Same thing in Australia and New Zealand, South Africa. Although it's a very multifaceted topic, Israel and the ways that Palestinians were historically expelled from territories especially post 1967, is another form of settler colonialism. And in turning these places, settlers come in and they put down roots. So settler colonialism, it really functions through a process of elimination and replacement, right? It's pushes out indigenous peoples, it eliminates them either through outright genocidal violence or just kind of subtle relocation, and it replaces it with the settler presence. And it relies on a myth of terra nullius to proceed. So now I've just thrown in another term, right, that you may or may not have heard of. What's terra nullius? Well, terra nullius is a Latin term. It means nobody's land, essentially no man's land. And it's really key to this settler colonial mythology. And especially in the United States, there's a way that we've constructed our history where the prevalent myth among a large segment of the population is that the United States built themselves out of nothing, right? That hardworking pioneers and hardworking settlers made a country out of nothing, built a country out of the wilderness, tamed a continent. We've heard this type of imagery and this invocation of this myth time and time again. And this is really key to the way that the settler colonial state constructs itself. And so you'll see common things, no matter the settler colonial state, you'll see these common refrains, right? Well, the land was empty. And then when you're confronted with, well, actually the land wasn't empty. There's indigenous peoples here. There were people here that were living here before we showed up. The motivation and kind of the excuse then turns to, well, these peoples, these indigenous peoples, they're so bad at using this land productively, right? Like there's these European forms of agriculture that have been developed, and there's ways that we've helped think of land tenure and the usage of land and exploitation of resources in Europe. And these people aren't adhering to these standards, right? And so in the viewpoint of settlers in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even 19th and 20th centuries, the refrain then becomes, well, these people are so bad at using this land in a productive manner that it might as well be empty or unused. We need to move in and we need to show them how to use this land up to its full potential. And so in Australia, this is actually a legal term. In the 1990s, there was a series of court cases that used Terranolius and this idea of what they called the doctrine of discovery to talk about the ways that British land claims and then the succeeding Australian land claims actually were on troubled legal ground, right? Because they precluded Indigenous Australian connections to the land. We also, while the term Terranolius isn't a legal term in the United States, in Canada, there's similar concepts that have inspired American and Canadian settler colonialism. So the picture here on the right is a very famous picture called Manifest Destiny. And this is a picture that if you look at it long enough, you can see the arc of American colonialism built and how it proceeded, right? And so we see Manifest Destiny itself, this divine woman dressed in white, kind of moving from east to west, east being here on the right side of the picture, west being on the left, representing the movement of the United States. And so under this idea of Manifest Destiny, it was viewed as the United States' God-given right to build a continent-spanning civilization. So you see here on the right-hand side of the picture, you see railroads and telegraph lines and farmers with plows and oxen helping to tend the land, and stagecoaches with people moving from the east to the west. You see, if you look a little bit closer here, you can see a busy ship port on what we can presumably think of as the Eastern Seaboard. As a matter of fact, I think this is kind of a rough representation of New York City, right? And the God-given providence of American civilization, moving to the west towards kind of a dark, untamed, wild continent. This is represented here by wild animals, by indigenous peoples being chased to the west, by bison being pushed away. And the idea was that under Manifest Destiny, it was the ultimate fate of the United States to push to the Pacific Ocean and to either tame the continent and assimilate indigenous peoples or to brutally eliminate them because they were getting in the way of American progress. Settler colonialism, as you can tell, is destructive in many ways. One of the biggest things was the destruction of indigenous identity. And so by the mid-19th century, it was viewed as less than tasteful to brutally genocide indigenous peoples, right? It didn't stop the United States from doing it. It didn't stop Canada from doing it. It didn't stop settlers in other places such as Australia from doing it. But the idea was that we were entering into a new civilized age. And while the settler states obviously reserved the right to deal out brutal violence if they felt the need to do so, there was the idea that, well, we might be able to actually assimilate these indigenous peoples, these natives, into broader society. The idea was that we're entering into the civilized age, and why don't we do more civilized things and maybe give them a chance in order to see what they can make of themselves in our society that we've built up. And so in the United States, in Canada, there was a broader policy of assimilation. These, quote, savage indigenous peoples were to be brought into what was deemed to be modern European society and civilization, European American, European Canadian society. Of course, there was no guarantee of full political rights. The idea was that, yes, we'll bring them into our society, but they're going to fill certain roles in our society. There was never any thought about, well, maybe we'll have an indigenous president of the United States. Maybe there will be an indigenous prime minister of Canada. Nothing of the sort, right? They were destined to fill lower socioeconomic rungs. In the United States, indigenous peoples, Native Americans, legally gained the right to vote in 1924, or legally gained citizenship. There were some Native peoples that didn't get the right to vote until the early 1960s due to various racist state laws and ordinances related to voting rights. One of the ways that this assimilation took place, and one thing that you might have heard more and more in the news nowadays, it's something that's certainly on our mind in Canada, is the concept of boarding schools. And so boarding schools were a form of assimilation that were targeted towards younger children. These children would be taken from their communities at a very, very young age and would be taken to these boarding schools that oftentimes were located very, very far from their home communities. The idea was that if you were far away from your homelands, you didn't know where to go, it would be less likely that you would escape. Well, why would kids want to escape schools? Well, in these boarding schools, they were very, very dark, abusive, violent places, right? At a base level, Indigenous children would come and they'd be discouraged from speaking their languages. In some cases, they would be beaten. In some Canadian cases, they would have needles shoved through their tongues if they spoke their languages. Their cultures were to be left behind as well, that their culture was literally beaten out of them, and they were encouraged to take up the ways of European settlers. Their religions were also discarded, right, in favor of Christianity. Many of these schools, especially in Canada, were run by the Catholic Church, and they were oftentimes focused on training for manual labor. So as I just said a couple of minutes ago, this policy of assimilation was never meant to make Indigenous peoples upwardly mobile, right? The idea was that, we can assimilate these folks into filling the roles that upwardly mobile white settlers don't want to do anymore. And so a lot of these schools were focused on training children in the industrial arts. They trained the boys how to, mechanical trades, and they taught Native girls how to fill domestic roles. And this is to say nothing of the other rampant abuse, especially of a sexual nature, that took place in these churches or these residential schools. And the fact that many children died, as I said, if you might be hearing about the increasing discovery of these mass graves of Indigenous children in schools in the United States and Canada. But through things like this, Indigenous identity was chipped away at, where the idea was that they would, to quote the late Colonel Henry Pratt, the idea of assimilation, the idea of these schools was to kill the Indian and save the man, to completely wash away this Indigenous identity. But destruction wasn't just limited to identity. We also see destruction of the land. And so in the context of the United States, you see a history of overhunting and destruction of animals and plants important to Indigenous peoples. In the painting of Manifest Destiny that I pointed out just a little bit ago, you saw bison being chased away. This sort of thing happened in real life. There was a systematic campaign to kill bison on the Great Plains because the idea was that the Dakota and Lakota and Nakota and other Indigenous nations that traditionally moved around in order to stay close to animals that they hunted, if there were no animals for them to hunt, then they would stay stationary and they would pick up agriculture and they would start kind of living by this kind of settler land-based sedentary kind of way. And there was obviously other overhunting and other overgathering and cutting down of trees and other things that really radically changed Indigenous environments and Indigenous landscapes. One of the kind of most egregious examples of this rapid destruction of landscapes that I teach in my coursework is, in the Missouri River Basin in the 1930s through the 1950s and 1960s, there was a project called the Pick Sloan Project. And the Pick Sloan Project was designed to create reservoirs on the Missouri River for irrigation and for recreation, for the benefit of people in the Dakotas and surrounding regions. So reservoirs, if you don't know, or even if you do know, just kind of a quick recap, is these are bodies of water that often are formed by creation of dams, where these bodies of water, rivers and streams kind of expand out, right? When this happens, territory more often than not gets flooded. The picture on the right here is the chairman of One Nation signing land away as part of this Pick Sloan project. And you can see here, this is the chairman here on the left-hand side. He doesn't look terribly happy to be doing this, right? He's in tears. And it's when you think about the history of this and you think about what he's signing away, what he's doing is he was forced to sign away thousands of acres of his people's land to be inundated underwater in the name of settler irrigation and settler recreation, right? Land that his people had had relationships with for generations, for millennia, was now going to be underwater. Really, really deeply traumatic time in our country's history. as well as yep, I'm seeing here in the chat, the history of the Salton Sea. So this is something that was not just limited to the Dakotas, right? We see this in California, in British Columbia, and in Alberta and other places like that. We have also even more recently seen other sorts of contestations over these constructions of dams and their effects on Indigenous landscapes. Of course, another thing that has taken up a lot more attention in public consciousness is energy production, right? Pipelines, mining, the extraction of petroleum from tar sands, oil tar sands in Alberta. These are things that also lead to destruction of the land and the radical reshaping of Indigenous landscapes in that way. So I want to show you, I'm a geographer, I love maps. I'll show you, we'll go a couple of cycles through this map created by a really, really awesome geographer down at Louisiana State University. And it shows the land claims by tribes, and it shows beginning in 1784, the rapid expansion of the United States and the rapid depletion of tribally owned and controlled land until, to the present day. So we'll go through this 2 more times, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is right after the Revolutionary War, continues. Those in California, 1850, California gets statehood, so you start to see this expansion of settler land claims on the West Coast, all the way to the present day, and the present day federally recognized reservation land in the United States. Remarkable difference, isn't it? Here's a less clear and vivid map, but we tend to think about, I want to do this in reverse, because oftentimes when we think about the United States, we think about a map, we have the map of the contiguous 48 states. And if we're lucky, we get a map that shows kind of Alaska and Hawaii kind of as kind of insets. These are the different linguistic groups of Indigenous peoples in North America. So that's including places like Greenland and the Caribbean and Mexico. So you can see there's a broad variety of diversity here. One of the things that we often talk about in Canada as kind of a side is we have that image as well as the different provinces and territories of Canada. And while obviously I don't expect you to be familiar with this, one of the things that we often talk about in these conversations from a Canadian context is the ways that much of Canada was opened up to settlement through a variety of treaties, right? These different land cession treaties. And so let me take a second here to talk a bit about what these land cession treaties kind of centered around. And so in both the United States and Canada, these treaties were signed, and for those of you that are savvy with international law, you'll know this. For people that are not savvy, the definition of a treaty is a binding document signed between 2 sovereign powers, right? That's how we understand it in international law. And so when these land cession treaties, such as these so-called number treaties in Canada, as well as land cession treaties in the United States were signed, they were signed between the United States in the context of the US government's Congress, and then in Canada, signed on behalf of the British Crown between what were ostensibly 2 sovereign sides, right? The Crown / United States on one side and Indigenous nations on the other side. And so these treaties were signed, and the idea was that Indigenous nations would give up land claims to these territories within these defined geographic territories and would move to reservations or reserves in the Canadian context in exchange for certain treaty rights, the right to hunt, fish, and gather in their usual and accustomed territories, treaty payments in some cases, in other cases, consultation with any kind of development that take place within these territories. The other kind of more deleterious kind of sad history of these treaties was that oftentimes these treaty rights were unevenly respected. The kind of motivation from settler colonial colonialism's viewpoint was that, well, these people are going to disappear, or they're going to be assimilated within a matter of time, and we're going to get all of the land anyway. So sure, we'll promise them whatever they want, because the idea is that they won't be around long enough to really take full advantage of it. When indigenous peoples did not just disappear like they envisioned that they would, this led to much conflict and a lot of continued contestation over the rights that are guaranteed to tribal nations. And so kind of showing this is, the treaty boundaries. This is what we understand of Canada today, right? This is the map that many of my students, my non-Indigenous students, kind of come in understanding of Canada. And I say, well, actually take a look at land such as this. Time kind of precludes us from doing this, but in other times when I've given this talk, there's a website called native-land.ca that actually shows the kind of contemporary connections to land that still endure with languages and cultural backgrounds. I'll probably drop that in the chat here towards the end of the talk, so that you can go and check that out. It's actually quite cool. You can look up your home city or where you're at now and find out, what nations have relationships with this land. Were there any land cession treaties that were signed? And it's really quite a cool tool. So I want to pivot now towards kind of another thread of the work that I do that focuses on environmental destruction and degradation of Indigenous lands, kind of going off of that destruction of the land slide that I first introduced us to. And so one of the things that I talk about is that, especially in the mid 20th century, we start to see other forms of environmental destruction on Indigenous lands. And so this picture here is an abandoned uranium mine on the Navajo Nation there in the American Southwest, not too terribly far away from you in San Diego. The idea was after the end of the Second World War, after the development of the Manhattan Project and America's entrance into the nuclear age, we desired to generate our own sources of uranium to power nuclear weapons that we would use to defeat the Soviet Union or the Chinese in a world war that was expected to be imminent especially in the late 1940s, early 1950s, as well as increasingly to power nuclear reactors and power plants. This was the age of the atom, right? The idea was that with this terrible power that we had developed, we could use it for protection and for military might, and we also could use it for very peaceful purposes. But that uranium had to come from someplace, and the idea was that, well, we need to develop our own sources of uranium extraction here in the United States to make sure that we have control over this resource for generations to come. And so there are large uranium deposits, or especially back then, there were large uranium deposits in places like the Navajo Nation and located neighboring tribal nations. And so the idea was that the United States Department of Energy would come in and set up these mines, and they would staff them with Navajo Dene tribal members, right? The idea was that, well, these reservations are mired in poverty, and they need jobs anyway, so we'll have them help mine uranium, and they would produce this uranium that was used in the American atomic program. And then once the uranium gave out, once the deposits were empty, they would leave these mines sit there. They would basically abandon them. And so by the 1970s, on places like the Navajo Nation, you saw a generation of tribal members that had extremely poor health effects from working in these mines with little protection. And you also saw these open mines just sitting on the reservation, basically without any kind of remediation, representing environmental pollution, right? And so when I teach about this, I teach about that history, but I'm always really cautious to not just focus on the Indigenous trauma side. I think it's poor practice to just focus on the negative. And so I start to kind of turn towards a positive. And what's the positive from this? Well, the Navajo Nation began to protest against this, that you saw tribal protesters and allies come together to say, you need to help us clean this up, and we need to do work to make sure that our reservation, our nation, our sovereign land is a safe place for future generations. kind of continuing on that sort of nuclear type of theme, this picture here is something that's a little bit closer to home for me, growing up in the Twin Cities. This is the Prairie Island nuclear power plant that's located just upstream from Red Wing, Minnesota, or about, I'd say 40 miles southwest of St. Paul and about 50 miles southwest of Minneapolis. So kind of nowadays, this would be considered kind of in the exurbs of the Twin Cities. So Prairie Island is one of 2 nuclear power plants in the state of Minnesota. It helps generate enough power to help power the Twin Cities and western Wisconsin and kind of the local region. But it also happens to sit probably about a few hundred yards away from the Prairie Island Indian community, which is a Dakota community located right next to the power plant here near Red Wing. And so this power plant, its location is problematic for 2 reasons. One is that there are tribal buildings such as a child care center that are literally hundreds of yards just away from this power plant. The unfortunate thing with power plants is sometimes they do have accidents, right? We think of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and in Fukushima. And so that's one potential threat to the community. The other one is this happens to be the Mississippi River right here. Growing up in the Midwest, the Mississippi River is prone to flood and sometimes will crest over and flood land. Now, the waste that comes from this nuclear power plant historically has been stored in kind of these concrete casks on the property. They're not buried any place. They're kind of stored outside while we figure out what to do with them. So the fear is that, well, if it floods, it could pick up those casks and submerge them and carry them away. And nobody really knows what might happen there. They might crack open and contaminate an entire stretch of the Mississippi River watershed and contaminate drinking water for millions of people, including this tribal community. Another thing even closer to home to me, the energy company Enbridge, which you may have heard of, kind of based on kind of certain current events, in Line 3. Line 3 is a pipeline that runs through northern Minnesota. The idea is that Line 3 runs from the tar sands fields in Alberta down through northern Minnesota to the twin ports of Duluth, Minnesota and Superior, Wisconsin, where the petroleum gets loaded up on ships and then shipped internationally. So this is the existing Line 3 pipeline. It's been around since the 1940s, 1950s, and has been transporting oil ever since. Now, Line 3, it's getting old. It's a 60, 70-year-old pipeline, and it's past its useful life, and it's time to replace it. And Enbridge says, okay, so we want to rebuild it. So the initial idea was that they were going to just rebuild it along the same route. And tribal nations such as my own said, no, you're actually going to relocate this. You're going to take a route that kind of avoids our tribal lands, and we want you to take that existing pipeline. We want you to dismantle it and take it off of our territories. This is something that people are getting arrested in northern Minnesota right now because of protesting this. The governor of Minnesota very controversially approved permits for construction to begin. So why is it that tribal nations are getting bent out of shape over Line 3? Well, the existing pipeline is problematic. We know about oil spills such as Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon, right? These are things that are kind of ingrained in American consciousness, especially around conservation and environmentalism. My own tribal nation is very near the site of the largest inland oil spill in American history. Back in 1991, Line 3 leaked out in the middle of winter onto a tributary of the Mississippi River in north central Minnesota, about right here. Millions of gallons of oil spilled out onto this frozen river. And to this day, we consider ourselves extremely lucky that that river was frozen and that the oil just happened to pool on top of the ice and was able to be cleaned up, because if it would have gotten into that tributary, it would have flowed just a couple of miles into the Mississippi River and would have polluted the drinking water source for millions of Minnesotans and Midwesterners. And so it is reasons like this that we are vehemently opposed to Line 3. In particular, myself, the existing site of Line 3 runs about 100 meters away from kind of an existing kind of settlement that members of my family have lived in, and our family burial site is located right next to the pipeline. It's not something that I want near there anymore. All of this is an example of what I call settler colonial violence, right? And so I'm going to get a little theoretical here. It's a technique of power. It is built upon this idea that settlers occupy this kind of upper position of power over Indigenous peoples and kind of can act in ways that affect Indigenous people and are violent towards them. And there's a sense of entitlement that settler colonialism can do such a thing. One of the things, I'm pretty big on Twitter. I have a kind of a bit of a moderate presence there. And one of the things that I often see when people kind of bring up this violence is you'll get people that'll be like, oh, well, why didn't, if the natives really didn't want this to happen, well, why didn't they fight back? Or people conquer other people, get over it. And I say, well, this is just an example of power, right? Settler colonialism through technological superiority and other forms of ensuring its kind of dominance has created this kind of landscape. And it kind of underpins the entirety of relations between Indigenous nations and the settler colonial state. And so when I talk about violence, I use kind of two terms to divide it. I say, well, there's spectacular violence, right? There's this armed violence, surveillance, like this form of violence that's meant to be seen, that's meant to demonstrate that, we're in control here. And if you step out of line, we'll take quick action to eliminate the threat. But there's also quotidian violence, right? Quotidian is a very fancy way of saying the everyday. Erosion of tribal sovereignty, the politics of recognition, which is a term that a Dene scholar, Glenn Coulthard, talks about. He's a faculty member up at the University of British Columbia, and he says, well, in the politics of recognition, what happens is that the settler state only allows aspects of tribal power to come through when it doesn't threaten the settler colonial state. And so I use the picture of the Mountie as an example here. The Mountie is an enduring symbol of Canada, right? And it's meant to be, the Mountie is oftentimes is presented as courteous, really friendly. In this picture here, you see it's showing him helping these First Nations children build a snowman. That snowman maybe looks a little problematic, but with the settler artist who drew this probably wasn't too concerned with historical accuracy, right? The Mountie is a perfect example of this. The Mounties had their start as a Northwest Mounted Police, which were founded in order to help kind of surveil and forestall any kinds of Indigenous resistance in what we called the Northwest Territories, which is still an actual place in Canada, but in the 19th century, it basically made up most of Canada west of Ontario. And so the Northwest Mounted Police would ride through Indigenous villages, and they function as kind of a form of surveillance and a form of very outright violence, but also they kind of function as this erosion of tribal sovereignty, saying, well, we can project force into your villages, into your settlements at any time. And so your sovereignty only really goes as far as we want it to go. So really kind of striking example here. So the question kind of pops up, well, what are Indigenous peoples to do in all of this, right? I've spent a lot of time talking about what's happened to Indigenous peoples, but we have to ask, well, what can they do in all of this? And this is where scholars such as myself have picked up this work. And so just as there's quotidian settler violence and spectacular settler violence, there's forms of Indigenous resistance that are spectacular and quotidian as well. And so these spectacular acts of Indigenous resistance are actions that are meant to be seen and heard. They're meant to be performative, right? They are meant to perform this act of pushing back against settler colonial hegemony and control. And they're perceived as direct aggressive challenges to the settler colonial state by settler society. So we'll turn to the American Indian movement. And so in the 1960s, as a result of processes like termination, where tribes lost recognition from the federal government in the United States, as well as relocation, there was increasing organizing among Indigenous communities in the US, in Minneapolis, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and et cetera. And this gave rise to organizations such as the American Indian Movement, which was founded in Minneapolis in 1968, that was founded as kind of a community awareness organization surrounding the incarceration of Indigenous men in prisons in Minnesota, as well as community safety, but grew into this nationwide movement that was meant to draw attention to Native treaty rights and Indigenous presences in the United States. And so one of the things that came out of this increased organizing, right, was the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz. And this is a picture that I took. I don't know how many of you have gone on those tours of the San Francisco Bay. When I was in San Francisco in 2016, I definitely went on this. And you can see there's still graffiti on the buildings of Alcatraz today. The idea was that Alcatraz was a prison that was no longer being used by the federal government. And under the Treaty of 1868, which was a treaty that was signed by the federal government and Great Plains nations, any federal land that was not being used would revert back to tribal use. And so these students and activists said, well, we'll occupy Alcatraz and we'll kind of form our own society on the island. And so they stayed there for a number of years and kind of built up this commune. This was the first really visible act of Indigenous kind of activism in the 1960s. A couple of years later, in the 1970s, the occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the idea was AIM came onto the Pine Ridge Reservation to help intervene in what they saw as the kind of infringement of tribal rights by the federally recognized tribal government there on Pine Ridge. The chairman of that government essentially kind of ran a dictatorial state on Pine Ridge, and AIM kind of stepped in to try to help influence an election that would have unseated him. Well, when AIM came to Wounded Knee, the tribal chairman called for help from the federal government, and you saw a 71-day standoff between AIM activists on one side and the US government on the other side. You saw a heavy American military and police response at a time when our involvement in Vietnam was was winding down as far as direct combat operations. Americans could turn on their televisions and then see jet fighters and helicopters and tanks on the prairies of South Dakota facing off against Indigenous individuals. So these are some early examples of this. There was also some concrete examples of Indigenous resistance in Canada, right? One of the biggest things was the 1990 Oka Crisis. And this centered around the proposed construction of a golf course on disputed Mohawk lands on an island very close to Montreal. And the Mohawk said this golf course will end up disturbing one of our cemeteries, and we don't want this golf course here. Well, when development proceeded, there was a Mohawk-led blockade where they literally blockaded the bridges leading to the island and also blockaded other key commuter routes near Montreal. Well, just like at Wounded Knee, the Canadian military and the Quebec provincial police intervened. And you saw these really, really striking scenes of Mohawk warriors with guns on one hand facing off against the armed Canadian military and police on the other side. It literally was as close to a war scene as you could get in 1990 Canada, right? Eventually the golf course was canceled, but this was a case where the world kind of saw that Canada, where we oftentimes, the Canadian society really likes to present itself as being very friendly and very multicultural and being very open. This was a case where the world saw that no, there's actually some very, very troubling tensions underneath the surface. I wrote about Oka in my comprehensive exams, kind of the midpoint of my doctoral degree, and one of my committee members, who he's Canadian, he said something really striking about this. He said, well, this was a moment where the Canadian state wasn't this friendly, benign, entity that they portrayed themselves as, but they were literally like a snarling dog straining at the leash, about to sick themselves onto these Mohawk in a violent manner. So it's one of those kind of acts of resistance that's really striking. Obviously, in recent years, we've seen with the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? People are probably more familiar with this, mass protests against the pipeline running through Standing Rock tribal lands. This pipeline represented a threat to drinking water in the Missouri River, as well as it came very close to burial grounds and other important cultural sites. And because it didn't run, when I say it ran through Standing Rock tribal lands, in the eyes of the company that built this, they would say, well, it doesn't run through sovereign tribal territory. But if you ask the Standing Rock Nation, they say, well, in the 1851 treaty that we signed, these are lands that were guaranteed to us that were stripped from us. They regard them as unceded lands right next to their current tribal territory. And so the company that built the pipeline did some very kind of showy consultations with the tribal government, where the tribal government said, we don't want this built here. In particular, they didn't like the fact that the pipeline was meant to run north of Bismarck, North Dakota, several dozen miles away, but it's a primarily white community. And the community said, well, what happens if this pipeline, springs a leak? We don't want this in our backyard, move it south. And so they moved it south near Standing Rock. And when construction began to proceed, Standing Rock tribal members and allies began to set up these protest camps out there on the prairie of North Dakota. And this was a highly visible action, right? This was kind of a case where a lot of Americans really saw kind of the contemporary existence of Indigenous resistance. Not only, you see these standoffs here between Indigenous peoples and, this militarized police, but it also sparked acts of protest and solidarity outside of Standing Rock. I remember going to rallies at Ohio State around this time in 2016 when this was going on, as well as kind of other acts of solidarity. Like for some of you that might have participated in this, for the longest time, the police were using Facebook check-ins to try to locate key water protector activists and try to go and arrest them. And so for a time, people that weren't on Standing Rock would check into Facebook at the Standing Rock Reservation as a way to try to confuse police and to try to prevent that kind of surveillance. There was an extremely violent response by the state, right? As I said, militarized police, flashbang grenades, spraying water at protesters in freezing cold temperatures, sonic cannons, the private security companies used attack dogs on them. This was a really extremely violent response from the state. I'm realizing I'm starting to get close on time here, which tends to happen when I get talking about things that I'm passionate about. So I'll move a little quickly through these things. And so those are acts of spectacular Indigenous resistance, but there's also acts of quotidian, everyday Indigenous resistance, right? These everyday acts of resistance based in cultural teachings, political sovereignty, and an understanding of history. These are no less of direct aggressive challenges to the settler colonial state. And so some of these things center around environmental protection, right? Things like increased monitoring of the effects of climate change, preservation of animals and plants that are important to Indigenous nations, such as bison, and the introduction of alternative species as replacements for animals and plants that are rapidly disappearing. These are forms of resistance as well. There's a tribal nation in northeastern Minnesota that the moose was a long time staple of kind of food production in their food diet. But as temperatures rise in northern Minnesota, the moose are starting to head north into Canada. And so that nation said, well, why don't we introduce bison here? Because they'll be able to live here with these warming temperatures, and then we will have that source that's similar to moose that we were ordinarily losing out on because the moose are moving north. So this is one example. The act of tribal sovereignty and the development of state-to-state relations. This is another form of resistance, and it's a challenge to settler notions of recognition and reconciliation. And so, as I talked about, the recognition before is the idea that, well, Indigenous sovereignty and political power only exists in ways that the settler state kind of view is non-threatening to it. And it goes alongside kind of in Canada, we have this concept of reconciliation, the idea that, well, Indigenous peoples, First Nations, and settler Canadians should come together and reconcile with each other and go forward as a multicultural society. Well, reconciliation kind of goes hand in hand with recognition. That reconciliation in Canada oftentimes takes the forms that settlers want it to, and Indigenous input is not really taken into account with this. And so when tribal sovereignty is actually allowed to really exist to its fullest, it pushes back against these things. It exists through these adaptive and creative usages of settler structures, such as courts and law and governments, to successfully advocate for tribal rights. And a lot of times it functions through, the education of governments on how to properly engage with tribal governments. So the picture here, this woman here is Peggy Flanagan, she's a citizen of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and she's the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. Peggy Flanagan's been a bit of a controversial figure in Minnesota, kind of in particular because of sometimes her silences on the construction of Line 3 over the protests of her own tribal nation. But one of the things that she's really excelled at doing is, being her together with these other women, which are these are chairwomen of tribal nations in Minnesota. They help to educate the state of Minnesota and county governments and local and broader state governments on how to, effectively interface with tribal governments, to understand that, you actually have to respect tribal sovereignty. You need to talk to tribes. You have to respect the treaties, and you need to do so in a really kind of genuine way that actually takes the needs of these tribal nations into consideration. Up in Canada, one of the things that has been going on, of course, in BC has been the ongoing contestation over the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is a pipeline that runs and brings natural gas over from Alberta and BC, interior BC, to the coast. Now, this pipeline goes through 20 First Nations territories, and they got consent from the elected governments of all 20 First Nations. But in BC in particular, BC is an area that was not covered by those numbered treaties that I talked about before, that there's a separate treaty process that goes on. Some nations, First Nations, are in treaty negotiations with the Crown, with the BC government, while some nations are not. And so there's a kind of unique political kind of frameworks in BC. And some of the nations, they have the elected band governments, but they also have a hereditary unelected leadership that speak for broader territories rather than just the, recognized band governments. And so with this construction of pipelines across the Wet'suwet'en lands of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, the hereditary Wet'suwet'en chief said, well, we don't consent to the construction of this pipeline. You might have gotten consent from the elected band government, but they don't speak for all Wet'suwet'en, and we have authority that predates colonization to protect these lands. And so when construction proceeded, what happened was the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their allies constructed a camp called the Unistoten camp right in the path of the pipeline. And it's a camp that's designed to reconnect and foster new connections between Wet'suwet'en and their traditional territories. And the way that this has been presented is it's been presented as a protest, but the organizers of the camp themselves, they say, well, it's not a protest or a demonstration. What we're doing is we're occupying and using our traditional territory as we have for centuries. And so they're really pushing back at this. They're saying, we're not protesting. We're just re-engaging with the land as we've always done. Yeah, sure, it's in the path of a pipeline, but that pipeline didn't have our consent to be here. And we don't need your consent to be in connection and be in community with our land in this way. And so in the last couple of slides here, I want to kind of close with the ways that we think about Indigenous identity. And so a lot of times there's this idea that Indigenous identity is formed by this concept of resistance, that Indigenous resistance is integral to Indigenous identity, and that, that Native people are destined to protest and to get in the way. And I say this is a damage-based perspective, right? It enhances this trope that Indigenous people are inherently violent, right? When we think about the image of like Geronimo holding a rifle, this is an advertisement for a gun company showing a Native person with a gun, right? Thinking that, what they do is they get violent, and they started out burning wagons and attacking settlements, and now they go out there and they protest and get in the way. When we think about Indigenous peoples as inherently violent, we justify repression and continued oppression, because a settler state is going to obviously be focused on keeping itself secure. What I want to push people towards thinking is more about resistance formed by identity. So to be Indigenous today is to present a effective resistance to the settler colonial state. And when we resist settler colonialism, more often than not, we do so by doing the things that our ancestors would have done before us, that we don't go out there, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel with resistance, but what we're trying to do instead is, we're trying to reclaim ways that have been handed down for generations. The fact that, me sitting here talking to you as an Indigenous PhD holder, the settler colonial state did not intend for me to be here. People like me personally, I should be assimilated. I should have been genocided away. But I'm here talking about this thing with you today. This is a form of resistance, right? This is doing what my ancestors would have wanted me to do, which is to spread this sort of knowledge. My own clan in the Ojibwe Nation, we're known as the intellectuals in our communities. And so I'm keeping in line with the teachings of my community. And when we think about resistance being formed and instead of being integral to identity, but identity being integral to this form of resistance, settler colonialism will fail in its ultimate goals of eliminating us and eliminating our presences in histories in the present day. In my people's language, we don't have a word for goodbye because we always feel that people will come back into our lives one way or another. And so I say to you, Miigwech Gigawapamin, which is basically the closest way we have to saying goodbye, which is thank you, talk to you soon. I'll leave this slide up for a second. If you have a question that you think of after the talk, as I tend to do when I attend talks, here's my email address. You can follow me on Twitter at Deondre Smiles. I tweet about Indigenous issues. I tweet about geography. I tweet about my cat sometimes. I actually tweet about her quite a lot. And I look forward to engaging with you there as well. And so I know we have about 13 minutes left, so I want to stop there. And I'd be happy to take questions or anything that comes to mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smiles, Deondre. Deondre does post a lot about his cat, who is the land orca, right? Tubby, black and white, and adorable. So thank you so much for sharing all of that knowledge with us. Painful stories, but also at the same time, really inspiring. So I'd like to, as Deondre said, invite you to ask any questions. You can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. You can unmute, however you would like to do that. Najat, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Smiles, for this wonderful, passionate presentation, very objective. It's hard to be objective once one witnesses such aggressions and the continuation of such aggression. So thank you very much. And I think it is valid and pertinent and timely to generate these parallel arguments of colonization that we have witnessed in the 20th century in other, not only in the 20th century, but also to generate these parallel lines with the colonization of Palestinians, that the media continuously misrepresent as anti-Zionistic, and therefore reduces this argument to a non sequitur and somehow builds walls against anyone who critically tries to address injustices, violence against and the stealing of Palestinian lands. So one wrong there makes it also wrong here. And if we decide to not look there, then definitely we are deciding also to make the injustices invisible here. The question that I would like to ask you is, how can you help us invigorate the discussion on identity? You talk about, that it's vital to address the identity in our teaching, do you have any suggestions for us? Because it's quite a trauma when cognitively our students, our Native American students, are not being acknowledged. Do you have any ideas for us, Dr. Smiles? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Naja, for that question. I think that one of the biggest things that I try to do in the classes that I teach is uplift Indigenous perspectives. And so for example, in a lot of the courses that I teach, my usual goal when I put together the reading list or things that we will cover in classes, I try to at least have 65 to 70% Indigenous representation. A lot of times I get even closer. I think last spring when I taught my Indigenous environmental activism class, I think I got pretty close to 90 or 95% Indigenous authorship in my reading list, and kind of including those kinds of perspectives. That's a really key thing because Native students, they are so used to having our, I speak for myself in this too, right? We are used to having our histories told by people that do not know our communities, that are not from us. And they tell the stories and they can distort them in certain kinds of ways, right? But by including Indigenous authorship, another thing that I do is I bring in Indigenous guest lectures into my class in order to, include that kind of perspective as well. Because I think that, it becomes a lot easier to, teach about identity and to strengthen identity and to strengthen the identity and the self-esteem of the Indigenous peoples is, students in our classroom, if they see that, no, people like, if they think in their minds and in their hearts that, no, people like me have a place in academia, people like me, I can go and find resources and find stories written by people from my community or people that understand, what I go through. Another thing is what I, and I tried to gesture towards this, but of course in a 50-minute talk, it's next to impossible to do this, but approaching identity is such a multifaceted, complex thing, right? Because it isn't just as simple as like, it's, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. If you get into Indigenous, you get into these questions of kinship and community. One of the biggest things is, there are Native American students in the United States that are enrolled in their tribal nations, but there are many more that are unenrolled that don't have those kinds of connections to these processes of colonialism, that some like me that didn't grow up on our reservations and that are disconnected from the land in that kind of way, people that lived on the reservation and dealt with the trauma that oftentimes comes with living on the res. If it's possible to do so, making space for kind of that multifaceted, interrogation of identity as well in the ways that you talk about things or the ways that you approach subject matter is also really, really, really useful in that way.
Doctor, is there a real effort being made to preserve the original language resources? I don't know how much of a literary tradition they have, but I know in the African continent, they lose like 13 languages every year. Are these people trying to keep their spoken language alive and document it?
I would say for many nations, yes. Especially in the last few decades, you have seen a lot of tribal nations really tie the language to their continued existence as a people and the health of their culture. And so in my, among my own broader nation, the Ojibwe, I feel like every other week I'm finding out about a new language table popping up. Language tables are classes where people get together to speak the language. As a matter of fact, in about 50 minutes, after I get done here, I'm going to an Ojibwe language class myself. I've been trying for about 2 or 3 years to.
Good for you.
Thank you so much. It's one of those things where I feel reconnected when I do that. And so yeah, there's a really, really strong effort. And there's a lot of obstacles. I know with some of my colleagues that have done Dakota language revitalization, they've dealt with kind of colonization of their resources, like outsiders coming in and kind of laying claim to like language resources as property and things like that. But it continues to get better all the time, right? I'm even struck in Canada. One of the first things I got when I joined my department is our resident map expert gave me, here's a map of all the languages in BC, and it shows like all the languages, like existing languages, and even languages that, you know, they don't call them dead languages on that map. They call them sleeping languages because, you know, calling them dead, you know, assumes that they won't ever come back. And, you know, and the idea is that, no, they're just sleeping. Maybe one day we'll be able to find the resources to wake them up again and speak them. And so there's that. Ralph asked a question, can I say a little about the fiscal military state that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks about in Not a Nation of Immigrants? So yeah, so Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks about this idea of the fiscal military state. And what she means by that is that it's a state that is constantly obsessed with making war, with further empowering itself in making war. I mean, I can say the United States is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest example of that, right? I think Dwight D. Eisenhower probably is rolling in his grave right now after warning about the military industrial complex, and then seeing nowadays where military contracts, you know, with companies kind of rule the day, and that there's always money in the federal budget to build jet fighters and to build missiles and to build, you know, new ways of killing people. Or, you know, one of the current things is kind of a Cold War history buff that I've been reading about lately is the need to refurbish the American nuclear arsenal, right? Weapons that, you know, no matter what we say, there's nothing defensive about a nuclear weapon, right? It is made for one thing only, which is to wipe out infrastructure and wipe out people. But then when it comes to things like the Indian Health Service, when it comes to respecting treaty rights, when it comes to social services programs, it's always like, there's not enough money for that, right? Like, what do you think we're made of money? If you take a look at the history of the United States, there's always been enough money for warfare. And as a matter of fact, we oftentimes are times of national prosperity are oftentimes very intrinsically connected to the generation of warfare, right? The advent of World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. Winning World War II and the need for generating, you know, military and technological superiority over the Soviet Union led to increased technology and led to the space race, things of that nature. And so, you know, the settler colonial state, because of its very nature, you know, it's a state that is built to make war, that it is constantly functioning through this constant war, whether it's external or even internal, against any elements that it deems to be a threat of itself. I'll stop there before I get like super theoretical and like into, you know, get deep into foreign policy and things like that. I will go here to the next question. So how do I feel that colonization will continue to happen in the 20th century, the 21st century that we should look at? In a reading in the Chicano Studies class this week, the author illustrates a parallel about how genocide of indigenous peoples occurred during early colonization and the way that Hitler executed genocide of the Jewish people. What is the parallel between early colonization and colonization of the 20th century? So the really kind of ironic thing is that people, when they talk about Hitler and they talk about the Holocaust, right? Oftentimes people think about it as something that just kind of was homegrown in European anti-Semitism, like the very systems that were at work in Hitler's quest for Lebensraum, right? Living room, and the ways that he was willing to exterminate entire populations in Europe in order to do so. If you take because I'll never recommend that anybody read Mein Kampf, right? It's like you have better things to do with your time than reading that book or giving any kind of attention to that. But scholars that have analyzed this talk about the fact that a lot of the systems that underpin the Holocaust and Nazi systems of extermination weren't just based out of European homegrown anti-Semitism, but they actually were taken out of forms of settler colonialism, right? That Hitler used North American theories of racial genetic superiority to come up with this theory of the Aryan race as this master race, right? And took the idea of the concentration camp didn't come from Nazi Germany. It came from camps that the British used in a settler colonial war against the Boer people of South Africa, right? Which, while it's tangentially connected to settler colonialism, because essentially the British and the Boers were fighting over, well, who has the right to hold dominion over Black African people in South Africa, right? Was it going to be the ultra racist Boers, or was it going to be the more subtly but yet still virulently racist British, right? And so I think there's very key connections that can be kind of made here, between the colonization as we see it proceeded in North America, and these ideas of racist, racist pseudoscience and things that came out of it, and what proceeded in the Holocaust. Definitely, I think that's something that can be really connected. Something that I read about in another part of my comps reading list was talking about eugenics and genetics and things like that. And all the stuff that I read, it didn't just talk about Nazi Germany. It also talked about stuff in California, right? Like John Muir of Muir Wood fame, right? Was a virulent racist that talked about, well, we need to make sure that we're creating this system of parks to get white families out there so that they can pass on their strong genes to their white offspring and ensure the continued dominance of the white race in California. So I'll stop there, but yeah, there's very clear connections there.
Wow, you just blew my mind with that last part. I'm going to have to now go look up John Muir. I was unaware. All right, so it looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat. Anyone, any last questions?
I have a question. First of all,
Go ahead, Doc.
Thank you so much for your work and your personhood and your communal reality. Thank you. So I've been hearing that for a long time, that some of the history of the peoples in the Americas, which includes everything you've shown us, that's what I'm referencing, that that they go back like 11,000 years. And then I've heard that actually there's a debate about that like they go back even beyond 50,000 years. So then I have two follow-ups. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So I have the great fortune in some of the work that I do to be in conversation with a number of really, really great Indigenous archaeologists, right? People that do work in kind of uncovering these kinds of histories. And there's been that dominant narrative in kind of broader dominant science that where the idea is that, well, Indigenous peoples came over on the Beringia land bridge 10,000 years ago, and that's where Indigenous peoples come from, that they're not indigenous to North America, but they're from Central Asia and from Siberia, Northern Eurasia. And a lot of times, while that kind of Beringia land bridge theory is sometimes it's benign, you also get some very racist anthropologists out there that say, and archaeologists that say, well, see, this is a reason why Indigenous peoples shouldn't be laying claim to the land, because they're settlers here too. And then you hear about recent discoveries, right, which is part of what I think you're referring to, where they find remains that date back tens of thousands of years, or they find pieces of proof like the idea that, oh, hey, the Beringia land bridge was actually covered by glaciers at the time when they thought that Indigenous peoples moved over it. And one of the things that I kind of find really funny is Indigenous creation stories have, for the longest time in academia, in broader academia, have been kind of pushed away, where they say, well, that's not rigorous, right? Like, that's just a bunch of like kind of mysticism and kind of hooey. And then you actually take a look at it and you kind of realize, oh, hey, these creation stories line up with new discoveries that we find geologically and archaeologically and things like that. And so you know, I'm of the school of thought where I'm like, no, I think Indigenous presence on this continent dates back a lot further than people kind of recognize. And if they actually stopped and listened to these communities telling the stories, they would find that these stories oftentimes line up very, very well with you know, what people find. You know, it's my constant annoyance. I'm like, it's you know, it's never valid when the Indigenous community says these things. It gets valid when a white scientist finds it, and then people are like, oh yes, look at this brand new discovery. And I'm like, you know, that community's been saying that for decades now. But I mean, you know, I guess, you know, thanks for listening to them, I guess. Like, you know, what are you going to do now that their stories are actually valid in your viewpoints? So that's the first part. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. And then the next question is, I've also heard that the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and those kinds of notions were actually not taken from primarily European common law or different types of scriptures out there, but in fact from its models of the indigenous people of these Americas. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, actually, yep, that is something that people have talked about as well, where yep, the idea that American law kind of comes from you know, tenets of Roman and Greek law, and the way that we generate the Constitution, or that we've conceived of the Constitution in the way that we've set up our government. But people have pointed out, they've said, well, actually, you know, the Haudenosaunee peoples of the Northeast, right, had systems of governance that obviously predates the United States that have very similar structures to the ways that the Americans developed their government. And so, yeah, that's something where, you know, even though, you know, again, there's always like this weird debate around it, but it's one of those things where it's like, well, you know, the Haudenosaunee have had these systems of governance for generations, for a long time. And if there's a similarity to the ways that they constructed their forms of governance to the American form of governance, and understanding the fact that, well, you know, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was among some of the first indigenous nations that colonists had exposure to in what we now call the United States. I would say, yeah, I think it would follow that, you know, I think there's a bit more indigenous origin in the way that we govern ourselves as a country than I think people are willing to let on.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And then a comment, if you would, on this idea that as Black, when I say Black, I mean 500 years of slavery and the legacy. And then also, when I say Black, I mean more recent people coming willfully here. And then that by choices, you know, that's very complicated too. So, but the difference, they're not coming over on ships in chains.
Mhm.
So as we work through that today, all the civil rights stuff and all that, today, some of the elders in the Black activist community and the African diasporic community that hold that consciousness are saying, no, we weren't brought here, we were sent here. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so that is, you know, that is one of the really big debates in a kind of broader indigenous communities sometimes is there's this move a lot of times where you know, the settler is used as this catch-all term for anybody that is not indigenous. And what's actually, you know, what's kind of been talked about is, well, the idea that, well, you know, people that were brought over as slaves, right, were it was done so against their will, right? It was they were sent over here in chattel slavery. They were sent here to Patrick Wolf actually really comes up with a striking example where he's like, indigenous land combined with African blood were combined together to create the gold of the South, which was cotton, right? The plantation economy. And so you're touching upon a really kind of controversial thing, which is like, well, do we call Black American settlers, considering the ways that they've come to be on these territories, and even broader, right? Like people that have come as refugees and things like that. Are they settlers in a certain kind of sense or not? They might be from an academic sense, but considering that they're fleeing from destabilization in their home countries, which oftentimes are legacies of the colonial history of these countries, right? Where a lot of post-independence African countries were placed in these boundaries that were drawn by European powers that outright ignored any kind of like community rivalries and things like that. Are these people really settlers if they're escaping to a power like the United States, which is a colonial power itself? These are really, really tough things to kind of think about and to really kind of address. As a Black Indigenous person myself, I tend to say, I'm like, no, they're not. Black Americans, I don't think of them as settlers, right? Because of their history and the way that they came to be here is different. But also, I think that it warrants a deeper interrogation of what it means to be a settler, right? I think that people that come over as refugees and things like that. I wonder if there might one day be an argument to be made that if they're coming here in good relation with Indigenous peoples and kind of recognizing this history, are they different than European settlers that came over with the express goal of holding land and kind of holding control? So I feel like this is kind of a partial answer.
No, this is to me, it's cutting edge evolutionary thinking and stuff. The idea of scent is being referred to by some of these elders as Black elders as spiritual. Like, hey, we came here and we have actual mission here.
Oh,
and that started 500 years ago. So even though we've been through all this abuse, we need it's kind of like you were doing. We need to reframe this. This is not about our resistance is not about damage. Our resistance is about who we are. And so I've just been hearing this and seeing it written about, like, only in the last 5 years, where people are flat out saying, no, we weren't brought here. We were sent here by a higher power. So then the spirituality of all of this, Black, Indigenous, and any other kind. And then the last thing that ties to it, if you will, reparations then. How does that, how do you, what could you comment on your thinking about, because Indigenous people don't talk about that.
So I think that reparations, it's something that I support, but I think that you also have to do it with land back, right? I love the idea of the concept of the debate around the Black Hills, where the United States has offered these people, Lakota people, they have a settlement sitting there that's millions, if not billions of dollars, that they're saying, here's payment for the Black Hills. And the Lakota have said time and time again, we don't want the money, we want the Black Hills back. And that's kind of one of those things where I think they kind of go hand in hand. I think that's true reparations. And sometimes they get positioned against each other, right? Where it's like, oh, well, Native people, we're not getting reparations. Why should Black folks, or why Black people are saying, well, if they get land back, we should be getting reparations. I say you should be able to do both. We're the wealthiest country on the face of the earth, and we've done so through the exploitation of Black labor and Indigenous land. And so, if I'm always an optimist, right? I'm always looking, I always look towards the future, and I always like looking towards the best possible future. And it's gotten me pretty far in life, so I'm going to probably keep doing that. And one of the things that I think about is like, what does it look like to give land back? And land back is one of those very broad things as well. What does that look like? And I think at the bare minimum, it says, well, you allow these nations to have the relationships with the land that they've been able to hold for generations, right? That you don't get in the way of doing that anymore at a bare minimum. Might it look like actually physically giving land back? Well, I hope so, right? I think that would be great as well. My own tribal nation, we hold 4% of the land on our reservation. That's it. I was like, what might it look like if we hold 100%? People worry, oh, well, they're just going to do this or that. I'm like, we're probably just going to like, you know, probably get out there on the land again and like live in good relation with it as we've done, right? But what might that also look like, you know, with monetary fiscal reparations to, you know, Americans who are descended from these people that have been exploited? I think these two things are kind of intertwined together, and that's how I always say we should be approaching this sort of thing, not one versus the other, but what can we do with them together?
But just like you said earlier about your relatives and thinking about what you would be doing here today,
Yeah.
and now that you have mentioned that you're Afro-Indigenous, that what those elders are saying now, I think you are definitely sent here. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you for those great questions, Doc. And yeah, we have been blessed and honored to be sent, Deondre, today to have this conversation. I feel absolutely enriched by this conversation and by your presentation, and I know everyone else must feel the same. So thank you so much for taking time to share with us today. And you know, everyone follow Deondre on Twitter so you can see his cat, the land orca. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Have a good night, everyone.
All right.
Do you need anything from me, Laura? Otherwise, I might log off and take a quick break before class.
I am muted. I don't. I think we've got everything all squared. So thank you again.
Of course.
I hope that you enjoyed interacting with our group. Lots of interesting folks, right?
Definitely. I really like that actually a lot.
That's great. Okay. Thank you so much. See you online.
Yep. See you online. Good night.
Okay. You take care.